Well, good morning, everyone.
Yeah, when they were trying to build that hospital.
Today is marginally better, perhaps, than yesterday, weather-wise, for us to come out here. So thanks for braving the gloom of autumn, always the gray blanket over the skies, but not as rainy today. My name is Trey Knatzer. I'm a faculty consultant at the Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching, and I'll be emceeing this roundtable, informal roundtable discussion here for the Leadership Forum. Of course, the theme leading across the generations, and this panel focusing on technology, specifically the title, The University and the Place of Technology, thinking about how technology works across the generations, how that can inform leadership here at the university. And we have a great panel that we put together across our generations here at UK, faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, to think about some of these really complicated, nuanced questions about how technology works, how it affects the way that we perceive the world, and how we can use it to alter the world around us. So first we'll get to introduce our panelists, and I just wanted to open with just a few remarks, and then I'll be quiet and have it be a true roundtable discussion. I'll also say that at any moment during the conversation, if someone wants to add something, raise a hand, ask a question, I'm not necessarily that wedded to being in control of this conversation. So the only thing is we'll need to, I think, carry a microphone to you so that those who are streaming this conversation and the recording can hear. So just be aware that we might have to carry some technology to you so that those who are not here might also hear your question or comment. So I think it's appropriately, it's coming up to Halloween, right? So I'm going to open this panel with a brief discussion of Dracula. My training is in English literature, writing and rhetoric, specifically 18th and 19th century British literature. And in thinking about what I wanted to say to open this panel, I said, well, it's almost Halloween. And Dracula, of course, is a story that we're all very familiar with, many film adaptations, Christopher Lee's, of course, being one of the more famous among them. But a lot of the elements of the original novel are kind of lost and we forget about them. And one of the things that doesn't really get a whole lot of attention in these later adaptations is the fact that this is a book that's really profoundly interested in technology, in new technologies in the later 19th century, railroads, telegraphs, and phonographs. And there's a moment that always stuck with me in the book towards the later part of the story when the team of vampire hunters is trying to piece together the story, trying to figure out what Dracula is, how he can be defeated, where he is, what are the methods, what's the lore. They're taking all their notes, they're combining their diaries, they're doing their research. And there's a moment towards the end of the story when Dracula destroys, most of their notes, most of their records. But Dracula, being of an older generation, in this case much older, right? A much older generation, he's not very familiar with the new and emerging technologies of the late 19th century. One of those being the wax cylinders that are the kind of prototype audio recordings that would be played in a phonograph. And he just doesn't have the frame of reference to know to destroy those technologies when he has the opportunity. And so he doesn't totally eradicate or wipe out the backup records. Right? This is one of the kind of first examples in fiction of backing up our files. Right? And this is kind of that indicator that across the generations, a difference in understanding technology, this new generation of vampire hunters, this old generation of vampire, a difference in understanding of technologies leads to a significant, plot development in the story, and ultimately leads to the defeat of the Count. Right? The way that we understand technologies is often a way of talking about generations and vice versa. I think they're two sides of the same coin. And in fact, we often use the language of generations to describe the development of technologies. When we think about the release of a new iPhone, the release of a new platform, the new incarnation of some kind of operating system, what is the generation of technology that we are using? We think fondly of Web 1.0, of the 1990s? Or perhaps even, are we beyond now Web 2.0 of the aughts? What are we in now? There are generations of technology use, and it's accelerating, it's dizzying, develops very quickly. On the other hand, technologies often stand in as a signifier for human generations. We think of the typewriter or the smartphone, or the old desktop computer, those old Macintosh computers that were big boxes and would sit on desks. These often just stand in now for a period of time and a generation that used them. And that's part of the backdrop of what we're going to be thinking about today for this roundtable discussion. What's the relationship between technologies and generations? How can this inform our leadership here at UK? So now what I want to do is let our panelists introduce themselves. And specifically, if you could just say a few things about your particular experience using technologies and what you do at the university, and how does that inform your work, and what kind of perspectives do you think you bring to a conversation on the university and the place of technology? So I'll pass this microphone around. Start with John.
Thank you very much. My name is John Larson. I'm a senior Games Fellow here at UK. I'm studying English. I guess, going off of your anecdote, I would be the vampire hunter. And I guess I'm also here as sort of the voice of a generation. I'm I guess what the term is a digital native. One of my earliest memories being the installation of a blocky old Dell computer in our living room. I think I was 4 years old. So I've essentially, all of my waking life have lived amongst it. And I hope that I guess I can bring that perspective, and also the perspective of a student, which, you know, this university is sort of all about us. Yeah, so I hope that I can build on what these guys are saying over here, and maybe just give a different perspective today.
I'm Michaela Ferroli. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Gender and Women's Studies department. I too, I guess, am a digital native. I got my first cell phone, I think, when I was 10 years old. It was the same time my mother got her first cell phone. It was a buy one, get one deal, so I got the extra one. I am also a teaching assistant. Did I say that? I'm a teaching assistant. So I'm in this weird gray area of not only trying to integrate technology into my classroom and trying to keep up with the hip new technology that the kids are using, but also navigate it in my own studies as well. So quite literally, I'm in between the two of them. Yeah.
My name is Mike Pennell. I'm Associate Professor in Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies. I'm also a Director of Undergraduate Studies. Regularly, and I think it's now 4 semesters in a row, I teach a humanities core class that's on social media, and we get, say, 70 to 80 students in there, which both makes me stay up on social media and reminds me every semester how much farther I'm falling behind. Because I'm of the Commodore 64 generation. Anyone here? Where changing the color of text was hours of enjoyment. So I feel like I'm constantly playing catch up, but I've also always been involved in tech, whether it's teaching or in research.
Great, thanks everybody. And y'all can just keep the microphone and pass it around to whoever wants to speak. So it's actually great that several of our panelists mentioned this distinction between digital natives and digital immigrants. That's going to be the first question that opens our panel discussion. And appropriately, I'm going to be reading notes from my phone here, so I promise this is not Candy Crush or something. So I teach writing classes here at UK, and leadership, like writing, often begins with audience analysis. What can we assume about our audience, and how might that affect our approach to a given situation or problem? When it comes to digital technologies, this distinction of digital natives and immigrants, and this is from Mark Prensky, 2000-2001. Digital natives and digital immigrants have become the default framework from which we understand technical literacies and technological immersion across the generations. Yet we should pause to consider in what ways and to what degree this distinction ought to inform our approaches to leadership here at UK. So from all of your experiences here, both personal experiences or your experience working at UK, what assumptions can we make about technology use across the generations? And how might that affect our efforts to build community, support student success, and foster a culture of leadership?
I don't have anything to say, unless...
Okay, is this thing on? Sure it is. So I'm interested in the idea of audience as well, and I think that if you're talking about leadership across the generations, people of a certain generation need to make, I think, assumptions about the generation that they are hoping to lead and instruct in some way. And I think that you can get some things right and you can get some things wrong if you are not belonging to that group. I think that when it comes to technology, even though digital natives or whatever, like myself, have not per se known another world, I think there are a surprising number of like Luddites lurking among us, like people my age, that I don't think is something that older people would expect so much. And I think that there is perhaps an overestimation of my generation's need for instance, technology to be integrated into the classroom. I don't think that that's something that we per se require so much as it is an assumption about what our generation wants out of a university.
Yeah, kind of stemming off of that, I have 2 points with this idea of audience. I don't ban technology from my classroom. I know some professors who do. I try to ask students to be respectful when it comes to technology. Pretty much like if you're on your phone, I think that I sense that as being more disconnected. But I personally like taking notes on my computer, you know, like for me it's just a much faster way to get down all the information that I'm trying to take in from class. So I try not to limit my students with the range of the ways that you can take notes, right? So the first point is don't judge the audience, right? I know sometimes I can walk through class and I will catch students shopping at Forever 21 or J. Crew, right? You know, that is a moment where that student is not engaged. And instead of solely blaming the student, I try and think, okay, what I'm doing boring? You know, am I not being engaging enough? How can I see this as a productive way to get students more engaged? But also, I use a lot of big words sometimes in class because it's hard to shut off my grad school brain. So when I say performativity to a bunch of freshmen that have never come across even thinking about their own gender as being something socially constructed, they have no idea what that means, right? But I keep moving, assuming that they do. But what I found is that their access to technology and to Google allows them to just quickly Google that word and figure out, hey, what is she talking about? So instead of just inherently assuming that if they're not seeming like they're actively listening to me and they're constantly looking at their computer screens, doesn't mean that they're not engaged. So that's sort of my first point. And my second point I actually have an example from class a couple of weeks ago. I have digitized all of their readings, and well, if there's one book that they have to buy for class. And the first couple of weeks, because I know, books are expensive, so I try to give them a few buffer weeks before they have to buy the book, right, if they're buying it from Amazon or another form of technology, right? And I actually had one student say, when are we going to start touching books again? Because I can't engage with the text as well being, through a digital platform. And that really blew my mind because I just assumed, being a digital native more than I am, I guess, that they would want these digital platforms to engage with, especially through their texts and their learning and their knowledge. So I think that was a really good point, John, to say that technology doesn't necessarily have to be integrated, but to withhold judgment of technology use in the classroom, I think is important, and of the audience, right? That they might not inherently be using the technology to go shopping.
Yeah, I agree with that, as frustrating at times as it can be to see laptops and iPads out in a class of like 75, many times, and sure, there's like fantasy football lineups getting set. I get it, right? So I'm aware that someone's injured, you gotta make a change. But there's multiple windows up, and generally also I find a lot of students, as you just mentioned, are Googling things you're saying. I find getting fact-checked, right, regularly, where I will sort of assume you're not, I'll try to walk around, see what's on a laptop, and I see that, no, they're actually looking into the history of Facebook, and what are the number of users currently on Facebook, how is that split across the country, socioeconomically. I'm like, oh wow, you're digging into what we were just talking about, partially fact-checking, but also partially just something caught your eye, you're just going to head down that rabbit hole, right? So I think there's some assumptions I have, both as sort of the teacher-student perspective and just generationally, how they're using technology. Also, I think I have assumptions about how, and I'm sure tech companies have assumptions about how their technology should be used. Everything from Canvas here, right, our learning management system, to social media, to games on our phones, that I think all of us as users adapt those technologies to our own uses. And many students don't use messaging apps, Snapchat, whatever it is, Instagram, in the same way that we might. Right? They're using it in different ways. Maybe they're using, I can speak, I have a daughter who's in 8th grade, and I thought for a while, wow, you're really into that Words with Friends game. Like, man, you must love to spell and play Scrabble. Actually, they use it as a messaging app. Right? It actually is just open because you can message the people you're playing with. That was an easy way to message your friends. And the game was going on forever. I'm like, has anyone won yet? She's like, no. And I was like, it's because you're just using it for messaging. And I think it's the same case that many students I find in class. They will say, well, I'm on Facebook or I use Instagram, but I only use it in this way. Right? I use it to find out information about people I meet. Or I use it to get reviews about things. Or in my sorority, we use it for this purpose. And I think, oh, wow, I never would have thought to use that app or that platform in that way.
I want to follow up on this idea of resistance. And John mentioned Luddites, and this is often a term, a concept that comes up in these conversations about technology, where proudly someone in the room will raise their hand and say, I am the Luddite among us. And this has become shorthand for, I am the one who either is suspicious of or resists technology, or perhaps someone who has a hard time learning how to use new platforms. Something that often gets lost in this gesture, those Luddites were not just resisting technology itself, but also resisting particular ways that technology was supposed to be used, in the way that, Mike, as you're saying, that there's ways that tech developers will assume that an audience is going to use the technology, or there's a design in how a generation is supposed to use the technology, just as with the Luddites are resisting this model of labor and ownership that industrial technology is beginning to represent
So in all of your experiences, what are some of the ideas that you've seen students resist the most, the assumptions that we might make about how they're supposed to be using technology, and what do they seem to resist?
It relates to my earlier example. You know, when you're teaching in front of 50 students and nobody seems to be engaging with you, I've cracked jokes, or at least thought I was funny. You know, what are you all, shopping or something? And everyone sort of looks up at me and they're kind of mad at me, you know, because I made an assumption about them that they were not paying attention. And so that may not exactly be resisting. Actually, I guess a more formal form of resistance that I have an example of. I tried out a new project this semester, one that might be not new for everybody, but I had my students interview a woman in a generation before them, and just they had to work in groups and come up with interview questions, and then they had to go off separately, interview their person, and build a website, whether through Wix or WordPress. And I got a lot of resistance for the website building part, because they were like, why can't we just write a paper? I'm like, I thought this would be fun. Like, you know, I don't want to read any more papers. I'm over that, you know, it's boring to me. And, you know, with building a website, you can include pictures and you can include memes and GIFs, and I thought videos, and I thought all these cool things you could get engaged with, but yeah, so there was some resistance there.
That kind of reminds me of the overload that some younger people will talk about, where every activity that they do has some associated platform that they have to use. They have to build a website for a class, they have to manage a couple of accounts for an extracurricular that they're a part of. They have approximately 50 different usernames and passwords that they have to remember to get access to all of these things. We do have a question out here. I'm going to go ahead and walk the microphone out. So we have some audience participation. It's very nice. Thank you.
Good morning. So this goes back to a comment that Mike said, and I think probably ties into the resistance, you know, in the classroom using technology to fact check. And yesterday our speaker referenced that the millennial and Generation Z, they don't see faculty and teachers and parents as the authority figure, it's what they find online. So how do you tend to manage that in the classroom when maybe you're going one direction and you have individuals fact checking you?
Yeah, it can make for a nervous situation. And I mean, I'm up front though and say, look, especially in the social media class and the way things change, I don't know everything. You know, I don't, even though I'm the instructor, in no way am I the authority on all there is about social media. And I'm open to the class, look, if you find something out, there's some news you hear, you think something I said doesn't match with what you have experienced, then tell us, right? Because maybe more people in the room should hear from you, and let's hear your perspective, and we can look into it. We can take a few minutes and let's, you know, bring up something on the screen. Let's go investigate that and see what it says. So I think you have to embrace it, because I have found fighting it just creates antagonism, and then it really gets this generational divide that, well, no, I know about, let me tell you, right? I was here before Facebook, there was a time. So I also think, I said it as fact-checking, and that probably, fact-checking sounds rather as a negative, right? More, I guess I would try to characterize it as, what's the?
Confirmation.
Yeah, confirmation, or just unpacking what you said. I'd like to find out more about it. Especially some of the history that I talk about with social media, and we try to trace, right, to Friendster, to 6 degrees to applications and platforms that came and went, in many cases before students in the class were using technology, even though they were born into social media, that there's some of that history before. So I think that keeping it in that perspective also makes it less of a fact-checking situation.
I think those can be really teachable moments, because I think because their authority is Google and all the other engines, they don't really know. When they see something on the internet, they believe that it's true, regardless of whether it is or not. And I think there's this, I don't know where they go to find out if it is. They just see it and they say, oh, that's true. And they don't know the difference, and not fake news, you know, but just not knowing that that's, just because they're reading it on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And I don't think there's anybody that really helps them parse through that and say, how do we know if something is or isn't true? And, you know, so I think that's a teachable moment when they're sort of fact-checking, they find something that's maybe against something that you know to be true or believe to be true.
Well, just last week, you could spend semesters talking about fake news. But we did spend a little time looking at social media's role in everything from satire to, if we have a spectrum, up to misleading, to what we might call biased information, to fake news. And we play at making fake news, right? Because it's easy to make and get out there on social media. So we do spend some time looking at statistics on the amount of news people get from, especially Facebook, Reddit, Twitter are the big three, where people go to get news. So we do look at those statistics and try to have some discussion about how do we verify what we see. And I have a checklist of things, like if you see something online and you think, that's interesting, I wonder, do run through this checklist, and if you can say yes to all of these, then maybe you can trust this source. But if it doesn't match one of these criteria, you might want to be skeptical before you go forwarding it along, retweeting it, whatever you're going to do.
I also want to pass that on to Michaela and John's, your reflections on this relationship between, we'll say, technical or digital literacies and truth, or truthiness, as we might say. So what do you think we can assume, what should we do about this problem of the fact that maybe truth doesn't exist as much as we understand the concept of truth to exist, and how do we work with younger generations to bridge that divide?
Yeah, that's my jam. Tearing down the big capital T truth. I'm all about that. And so it's totally teaching moments, right? And I would even push this further to say, like, this isn't just a teaching moment within the classroom, right? This is a teaching moment with your racist uncle at Thanksgiving, right? Who saw a meme on Facebook and just now assumes that, I don't know, there are hundreds of millions of people flooding into America, right? Like, this happens not just in university spaces, but in life. And so I use it as I just said, as a teaching moment, and to say, like, the world around us is not as it seems, right? Like, it's not as natural. It's been naturalized. And that there's not just one big truth, right? There's a multiplicity of little truths. There's a multiplicity of lived experience that makes up that person's life and how they perceive things and how they look at the world. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's a totally feminist moment to challenge and push back on even saying, like, yeah, I'm not the authority, right? Like, adults aren't the authority. You know, children make knowledge and young adults make knowledge, and there's a range and variety of knowledge producers. And what is important is developing those critical thinking skills. You know, if you go to ihateliberals.com, yeah, like, that might not be the best sort of source to garner some information, but it's also, yeah, breaking down these barriers of thinking, you know, you can only get accurate and truthful knowledge through, like peer-reviewed journals. Like, I don't think that is necessarily true. There are a lot of feminist blogs that have new production of knowledge that challenges the way we think, not just outside in the outside world, but in the academy. Yeah, does that?
That's good, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that I think that my generation doesn't necessarily have a monopoly on falling into false narratives that can be in part perpetrated by social media and widespread technology use. In fact, some of the most ridiculous things I remember seeing on the walls of Facebook were shared by older people, and that's not to put anyone on the spot. That's not to put anyone on the spot, but I think there's a level of skepticism that blurs generational lines, and I think that if there is a danger to this increase in sort of unvetted, I guess we could say, information, it is that whichever narrative you want, you can find it really easily. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing new about yellow journalism, but it's much easier to get your hands on information that plays into a certain worldview that you want because of the internet. Good question.
So this kind of ties into a couple of questions that have been asked. Before my current reincarnation here at UK as a faculty developer, I was an English teacher and I taught at an alternative school for at-risk students who were very resistant to technology unless I told them to use it to prove me wrong, and then they were all about it. So I guess my question is, do you see talking about using technology-enhanced classrooms as a way of letting students know that the teacher is not necessarily the instructor, it's not necessarily the authority, that they are your guide? So do you see that as kind of the way that we're going, where your instructors are no longer the authority on this, that they're more the guide to point you in the right direction? I work over at the College of Pharmacy. We have this huge shift in our curriculum right now that I'm struggling to get my faculty on board with, where they front load all of their basic science and pharmacology and all of the reading and lectures, and they use the class time, it's a flipped classroom, for engagement. And so I'm having a hard time getting both the faculty and some of the students on board with understanding that you're not paying the teacher to teach, you're paying them to make sure you can apply what you've learned elsewhere. So do you kind of see that's maybe the direction that technology is pushing us?
Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying, and I think that it's funny. I saw this post on Twitter about hours ago when I was waking up, and it said, I think that it's really funny how to go. It's like, oh, college is the place where you pay thousands of dollars a year to have someone read from a PowerPoint, and you still have to pay for printing. And I think that that's obviously an oversimplification of what we get here, but I think that the complaint is real, which is that sometimes technology making things easier is not necessarily desirable in the classroom. And I think that if you have a situation where, yes, the teacher is reading the information from the PowerPoint and the student is looking it up on Google, and then they have a moment of realization, well, why am I not just doing this for free? Then that, I think, is an important concern that should be addressed. And I think that earlier, before we got on the topic of capital T truth and its non-existence, the topic was does fact-checking, for example, like undermine the classroom? And I think that there's always been students that would speak up and attempt to disrupt teaching with smartassery. But I don't think that, I think that the place of technology and the place of the teacher, the relationship is not necessarily the teacher gives information, because information is always out there. And before the internet, the information has always been out there. You can go to a library and learn whatever you get here. But the role of the teacher has always been, I think, in elucidating that and making it more digestible and, as you said, applying it. So I don't think that technology has changed that role, but I think it has caused an anxiety about what the role of the teacher is in this new digital landscape. But I really don't think that it has changed as much as people would think.
Actually heard from Trey's colleague the other day that no longer are we the sage on the stage, but we're the meddler in the middle, or something like that. I don't know if there's been another iteration.
Did they say meddler in the middle?
I think that was the one where we're at now.
Okay, we're not the guy on the side. We've moved
past guide on the side because
Yeah.
because of this anxiety, right? That students are like, you've given me so much space to be my own teacher. How do I know if I'm extracting enough and the correct information? And that's something that I get frustrated with in graduate school classes. This whole facilitation model where basically grad students are running the course throughout the semester, and there's little to no interruption or guidance by the professor. I mean, it varies, right? I'm not nailing everybody to the cross here, but it is this anxiety-producing moment of I am spending thousands of dollars, potentially, and I want to get my biggest bang for my buck here. And if I'm not being taught by somebody who is supposedly in this authoritative role, who is the master of this knowledge, how do I know that I'm getting all of the information that I need to move on? And so I think it's about balancing, right? It's about letting them know, I'm here for you. I want you and need you to master certain skills, but how we get there can be a bumpy road. And it doesn't have to be, I think failure is really productive. It doesn't have to be just negative, it can be positive.
And so Michaela just mentioned failure, and that's just a great segue, I think, to another question that I thought would be nice for our round table to chew on here a little bit, and it's on failure. This is something that, for leaders especially who deal with technology, we have to think about the relationship between technology and failure. So even though we often talk about new innovations in technology in these terms of speed, efficiency, and progress, there's also this shadow rhetoric of technology is slow, cumbersome, inefficient, retrogressive, and perhaps at worst, inauthentic. So in a word, our encounters with technology are often encounters of failure. So in this spectrum of human-technology interaction, something breaks down. Something doesn't work as it was designed to or it was expected to. Something has unintended consequences, or it presents a problem that is too difficult to solve. We've all had these encounters, but they often remain mere frustrations at best, and at worst, they can disrupt our work, create more problems for us. So in your experience, either just personal, scholarly, academic here at the university, what are some useful ways of responding to failures of technology beyond the immediate lesson of learning what not to do next time? How can this inform leadership at UK?
I'm actually drawing from a disability studies model here. I think we often assume that, right, people just, technology is going to help us. But quite often, when the person is constructed as this able-bodied, functional human being that can interact in a normalized manner, we forget that technology can actually hinder and hurt people. For instance, if you're only giving PowerPoint lectures and somebody is blind, right? And they can't engage in the same way that perhaps other students can. Or if you as an instructor are deaf and the way in which you need to engage with your students just totally changes the atmosphere and ability to connect with your students, right? And so what I've found is that instead of, as I mentioned earlier, seeing failure as a moment of negative association, to see it as one of possibility, right? How can we, okay, that moment failed. How can we then move forward and see how to incorporate new and different types of learning? What I read in this article, you know, that there were two professors, two scholars, and one was blind and one was deaf, and they were co-chairing the MLA Disabilities Committee. And they started to realize, you know, this is a really feminist model of sharing work, right? You know, they're not putting all of the work and the labor on one person to head this committee. Instead, they're co-chairing, and they're using technology to gain access to the ways in which that they are normally marginalized or oppressed. Yeah, I think if we see failure as not as something to avoid, but as something to use as a learning moment and as a moment of, okay, somebody was left out of this. How can I rearrange what I do in order to make sure that everybody is included?
It's a pretty radical way to think about it, too, because often we kind of shut down when technology fails, right? We can't really think about it as this opportunity that you're framing it as. It's good. Other stories about failure and responses.
I found myself thinking, when you're talking about the failure of technology, and what like Mike was saying earlier about how technology is, we'll say, marketed, or how it is perceived as it should be used, is often very different from how it's used like in reality by people. You mentioned like the Words of Friends example. I think that's very funny because I always use it just for Scrabble, but that's so smart. And I think that there's a certain dialectic going on between perhaps if we're talking about like Luddites and people that oppose technology on like ideological grounds, and companies that profit off of the use of their technologies. There's a way in which the users, the everyday users, find themselves in this kind of liminal state of not knowing, of going in between. And I think that it's easy with the tech companies to fall into the hype and to perhaps overreach what you should really be using the technology for. And I think that always, if you are an instructor, you should be thinking like better, faster, easier. But I don't think you should be thinking different. But often different is what sells and what creates hype. And there are revolutions, you know, on a weekly basis in the way that we do things, supposedly. And I think that falling into that too much is often what creates these moments of frustration and failure, and ultimately a disconnect between generations and between like instructor and student. And so I think that a certain skepticism towards what you should be using technology for, and a certain attention to how people actually use it versus what is said about it or how you believe it should be used, can go a long way in avoiding those moments of disconnect, because if we're using technology and it's leading to disconnect, then it has like utterly failed, I think.
I think that whether it's social media, technology in general, has lots of good cases of failure that you can study and have students look at. Right, Google Plus, I always bring up, which I remember when that was it was going to be the big thing. We would all be Google Plusing, right? And it just, for whatever reason, didn't take off, right? It just couldn't go. And even, we can trace, right, MySpace reached this peak where you would probably assume this thing will never die. And it died quickly. I mean, it fell off in a hurry, to the point where you were embarrassed to say you even had been on it, right? There was not a failure, even the technology, there was a failure of people willing to admit that they, at one time, used that application. So there's lots of cases of failure, and talking to students about the idea that we used to go to Blockbuster Video and rent movies, right? That there was the idea that I think Blockbuster felt like, no way this Netflix company is going to ever overtake us, right? We will never fail. But then every media, right, has run into the same thing. Bookstores close, right? What else? Music, the music industry, Napster, right? I love watching a documentary of Napster with students because they see the culture of free that developed from Sean Fanning, and while Napster sure didn't last, what got set in motion there in the music industry, they now see, as they look at their phones and think about the way that they listen to music, whether it's Spotify, the expectation that things should be free, easily accessible. And so, again, a case of failure, but really had lasting implications for really all forms of media. So I think that in many cases, failure can be a real great learning experience. Not just in hindsight, even in the moment, as hard as it is, if we've taught long enough, we've had projects and classes that have failed, right? Not students that failed, but wow, that was just poorly done on my part. And so using that, I thought, well, okay, luckily there's another semester. Different students. We can revamp this, we'll try it again. And getting feedback from students like, I got the feeling that didn't go well. And they'll tell you, yeah, it didn't. Okay, well, what went wrong? Let's talk about that. You can help future students.
I think what's compelling about that is that there's this change in the idea of ownership that you're talking about has been brought about by new technologies, and this idea that information, the digital information, is something that is proprietary, is kind of going the way of the dodo, as you're saying. This is something that a younger generation just doesn't resonate with them. This idea that we own digital information is something that should be freely accessible. There was a hand up here.
So kind of piggybacking off of this idea of failure, I'm thinking about like people as rational actors versus emotional, and how technology plays into this, because I think we kind of have a tendency to see technology and social media and the internet and everything as this inevitable forward roll of progress, and it's going to eventually be perfect and good and rational, we're going to use it appropriately, et cetera, and I don't think that's how, I don't think that's how that has ever played out. And so kind of the emotional and imperfect way that we use social media and how that plays into either its failure or its success, it's not really a question. But if you have anything to say about that, if you can formulate that into a question you can answer.
I don't know if this will answer your question, but this is what where my mind sort of shot to. There are a growing number of people who have been able to mobilize emotion through the internet, and they're neo-Nazis, right? They have, in the alt-right, they have used digital platforms to create memes, to create websites, to create, Reddit and Twitter, these ways to connect across space, right? To shrink this time-space compression, or to shrink the time-space compression, right? So in a really interesting case study, they would be a population of people to look at how they have harnessed emotion and affect as a role in influencing how people think, right? Because narrative is extremely powerful. I was watching like a short 20-minute documentary about the role of the alt-right in meme making. They're like a meme making war machine, basically. And they went to this like neurologist that works for the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense is doing loads and loads of studies on narrative and narratology and looking at how statistics actually don't influence people. People just think that like they're just numbers, those don't matter. But when you tell somebody a story, when you bring emotion into it, when there's some sort of value to it, if that person can connect to it, then it becomes really powerful. So I think if we can think through, okay, well, how do we like harness it, but in a way that fosters humanity, right? Versus like inhumanity, I guess would be the opposite of that. Right? Versus dehumanizing people. How do we foster empathy through technology and leadership? Yeah. So I answered your question with a question, but something to think about, I guess.
So in classic, you say classic academic style, you answered a question with a question.
Exactly.
Or a question that maybe perhaps wasn't actually a question, but more of a statement. Yeah. And then what's interesting about what you're saying, Michaela, is that there's two sides to this coin. We have this idea of big data, and we can store so much information, and we use this as evidence that our decisions are evidence-based, are rational. But the shadow side that you're talking about is that perhaps these technological developments are merely amplifying the, like you're saying, I like the phrase used, the mobilization of emotion and affects, the power of the story, the power of the anecdote. In the face of all kinds of evidence and data, the power of the one story is something that either social media or broadly speaking, the digital technologies that are emerging are amplifying for others, something to keep in mind, as we move forward. And we only have a few minutes left, so I do want to open up for more questions from the audience, comments, something that we didn't talk about that you'd like to hear, something you'd like to follow up on.
I have a question about assumptions of technological competence in younger generations and whether that risk, setting them up for failure. The presenter yesterday started with digital native in the morning, and he had this video with the grandparents greeting their grandkids and handing over all their broken technology and saying, "We're glad you're here, none of this works." And my first thought was, those grandkids maybe don't know how to fix it either. In the afternoon, he switched to digital dependence. And the question is whether we risk sort of setting up a younger generation for failure by assuming they're more technologically competent than we are. Is it true that the student coming through today actually has better debugging skills than somebody that was using an MS-DOS prompt? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that we should not assume that they should be handed all of the broken devices, or I broke Facebook, right? Can you fix it? Yeah, I think that again, I think that many young people use technology in idiosyncratic ways, right? I mean, we all do. So I probably can't fix your whatever it might be, your laptop, because I don't know how you use it. And I'd have to sit down and watch you use it for a while to fix it, because I know, it's also the throwing out the instruction manual, right? The day of reading the instruction manual, I think maybe it was a long time ago. But we just play with it. And for the most part, when introducing students, if they're not aware of the technology, maybe we're going to build a website, or it's a new social media app that we're going to try, I say just play with it, right? You're not going to break it. Just see what you can do, and then you'll learn it as you go, right? Don't be worried about doing something wrong. I do think, and this is maybe anecdotal personal experience in dealing with my parents, aunts, uncles, that there's the idea that you will break it. That, well, I need the instructions because I'm worried I'll break my iPhone. I'm like, no, you just need to just play with it, do stuff with it, right? You don't have to go visit the Apple store every time that you, like, something looks like it might be going wrong. My parents are in the Apple store, I think, weekly. They're like on a first name basis because they want that help. But I think that's not really a digital native immigrant. I think that that's just being comfortable with technology and the way that we use it. So maybe it's more problem solving in that case, or getting over sort of that.
Yeah, my grandma, we got her an iPhone a couple of years ago, and she was really obsessed with getting a manual. And she would talk about it. She's like, my friends have told me there's a manual. She's like, what do I do? I was like, don't worry about that. And I think that that's true. I was like, you use it how you're comfortable using it, and I think that that's true. And with students as well, that we don't know everything. It's gone beyond what any one person can completely understand. And I think that if you're an instructor and you look up, oh, okay, so I want to use, you look up something online and you find, oh, okay, so if my students can go into Audacity and record an M4A file and then convert it into MP3 and then upload it to Canvas, then we'll be good. And you spent your time doing your homework on that, and so you think, well, they're the digital native or whatever, and so they'll understand it. And then we get there and we're like, okay, but I don't use it to record audio, I use it to do other things. And so I think that, yeah, there's no like magic potion, and there's no manual that we have read that older people have not. It's just a matter of how.
Don't tell them about it.
Oh, sorry. We'll talk about it at the next meeting. Yeah, but it just comes down to a matter of use. It's like any other language that you learn. Like if you want to learn German, you speak with other people and you learn what you need to know. Sitting there memorizing cases all day is not going to get you very far. And I think it's the same thing with technology, and that professors shouldn't, on one hand, assume students will have the dexterity with it because they're 20 years old. Why wouldn't they? But like, yeah, but there are things that we use it for, and there are things that we don't use it for. And so it comes down to, again, like understanding how we use it. I love the words of phone example. That if you can understand that, then you can learn how to effectively utilize the tools for what they are being used for.
Michaela, did you have?
Kind of. It relates to what we were talking about just right before, this idea of failure. Perhaps, right, younger people are seen as, well, it's actually statistically been proven that younger people are risk takers, right? So they're more open to this idea of failure. And so if we can, again, reconfigure how we think about failure, not as like you personally are a failure, that you couldn't master XYZ skill and that's why your iPhone broke and now you need to go to the master who knows how to just unlock it because you put the wrong passcode in 100 times. No. It's reconfiguring how we think about failure, right? To think through, okay, well, what structures, right? What ideologies, right now I'm getting kind of meta with technology and failure, right? But like, what limited us and what might have forced us into failing? And how can we reconceive possibilities of failure that are productive? Yeah.
It kind of makes me think about how these, in response to this question, and sort of as the maybe concluding remarks, since we're at the 10 o'clock hour at this point, but the question of how much should we assume about young people's technical literacies, and how much should we offload and just say, figure it out yourself. I think what Michaela is saying and what our other panelists have said so far has made me think about how technologies, whether it's Facebook or Audacity or Canvas, these are implicitly modeling the way that the world is. In terms of Facebook, it's implicitly modeling what a person is and how people interact, what counts as a person and what doesn't, and what are the ways that you're allowed to interact with others and to what effects. And by offloading this idea of figuring it out it seems like we lose a lot of opportunity to talk about alternate ways of seeing the human and the world that maybe aren't covered by this format and this technology. What counts as a class at the university? In many ways, an LMS determines that, right? And in many ways, it's working for us. But it's also useful to consider, like Michaela was saying, from a meta or larger viewpoint, what are these modeling about the world? And that's something that, as I've read in studies of the way that young people use technologies, when we talk about digital natives and digital immigrants, it's probably more accurate to talk about digital immersion, but it's where young people are more immersed in technology in their everyday lives. It's more integrated in their everyday lives. But there is a wide variety of understandings of how technologies work, for what purposes they ought to be working, and how the technologies shape people's perceptions of the world, whether it's the mobilization of affect or whether it's the way that we're communicating with others and the language that we're allowed to use on those platforms. With that said, just could we have a round of applause for our presenters? And thank you, of course, to all of the organizers of the Leadership Forum for supporting this panel where we can hear from the people themselves about how this is playing out in everyday life. I hope that everybody has a great rest of your Leadership Forum and